I'm Sam On, and with me is Jason Book, and we are on the weekend now of Fantastic Four having just been released, which wraps up the comic book movies for 2015. And Jason and I were kind of talking about how this might be the end of an era for comic book movies, kind of ending on a flop, but that's Fantastic Four's fault. But if you look ahead to 2016, it looks like this could be the beginning of a new era, because we get Deadpool going rated R, we get Batman v Superman, which looks like it's going to be bringing things up a notch. We've got Apocalypse, we've got Civil War. So it looks like 2016 onward might be this kind of like really mature, intense era of comic book movies, which then means we think that we have just concluded an era of comic book movies, which we are calling from 1998, kicked off with Blade, to right now, 2015. It's kind of like this, the rise to prominence of comic book movies. So what we're going to do is kick off our top 5 comic book movies live action from 1998 to 2015. I'll start with my list. So my top 5 goes like this. Sin City at number 5, then Iron Man at number 4, number 3 I have V for Vendetta, number 2 Man of Steel, and number 1 I have The Dark Knight. Jason, what do you have for your top 5?
Well, at number 5 I've got Sin City. At number 4 I've got XMen. At number 3 I've got Avengers. At number 2 I have SpiderMan 2. And at number 1, I also have The Dark Knight.
All right, so we have a couple things in common. We have Sin City at number 5, and we both have The Dark Knight at number 1. So let's start talking about Sin City. What are your thoughts on that movie?
Well, I mean, just stylistically, it was amazing. It was a super cool achievement for comic book movies. A black and white comic book movie with splashes of color. Come on, it was perfect. It was a direct translation from the graphic novel, and it worked really well. The fact that even Tarantino did a guest spot as director for one scene, it's killer. Definitely not for kids, but it was super original and opened the door for some comic book movies that weren't made by Marvel and DC.
Right. I agree with you on all those points. I mean, visually, this thing just like leaps off the screen. It's so intense, and the way that it uses the black and white and the color was just so cool. I remember the first time watching it and just kind of being blown away by it. And then, like you said, having another comic book movie in the mix that's not one of the main superheroes, a different style of storytelling, and just that visual presence, to me, that's what gets it on my list. Mm-hmm. So I had Iron Man coming up, which I put on there because, to me, it's a pretty memorable introduction to the character of Tony Stark and Iron Man. I thought they did a good job in terms of like origin story, and Robert Downey Jr. has, sort of made buckets and buckets of money for his portrayal of Tony Stark, but the reason is because he really was onto something there with his portrayal of Tony Stark, and it kicked off with this movie. I also have Iron Man on my list because it kicked off this shared universe, and so I give it some credit for being the sort of initial linchpin to that.
Totally. I agree with everything you said. The only reason it's not on my list is something had to go. It was in my top 10, but I picked the Avengers for reasons I'll explain later. But man, Robert Downey Jr. is Tony Stark. He nailed it. It was a classic. It holds up really well. And like a lot of movies with CG, a lot of the CG is done with things that aren't human, which is supposed to be the armor. Yep. I think it'll date well that way as well.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Now, I will say, for me, a lot of the Marvel movies since Iron Man have not risen to the quality level of Iron Man. To me, Iron Man has just a little bit more gravitas. It has a little bit more to it than a lot of the more recent ones. A lot of times when I watch the Marvel movies, I enjoy them, but they're a little bit more kind of popcorn fare or a little bit more like just fun entertainment. But this original Iron Man, I think, was actually a little bit of a step above a lot of the other Marvel movies.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said. One that was on my top 10 but not on the 5, or I may have had to take it off, was Winter Soldier. That might be an exception to that. That was a super well, executed kind of a dark Marvel movie, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Sure. What are your thoughts on your X-Men, so going over to the Fox side and their take on the X-Mutants?
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, this is before the shared universe thing that Marvel had going on, so X-Men was the first time we really got to see all these classic characters together in one movie. And they killed it. The casting was great. The directing was great by Bryan Singer. And the main characters of Professor X by Patrick Stewart and Magneto by, what was his name again?
Ian McKellen.
Ian McKellen. They just nailed it. And the fact that they were even super cool as older actors playing these characters made it even better, because there was kind of an written history that, anyone that knew the comics about what went on between them just made the performance even better. So I loved it. I mean, yeah, there's probably some hokey CG in there stuff now, but it was a perfect choice for Wolverine and all the bit characters as well, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I agree with you that Xavier and Magneto, they gave such a personal depth to the conflict that really complemented the action that you were seeing.
Yeah, you got it.
And some people would actually say XMen was the start of the era, so they would say the era was 2000 to 2015.
Yeah.
We went back a couple years to Blade because we also think Blade was a pretty great movie that really corrected the ship after Batman and Robin. So,
yeah, it sure did.
But pushing forward, so I had V for Vendetta. We probably don't need to talk about this one a lot, but to me it made my list because they really took on some political issues. I think it had a cool visual style. It had some really memorable characters. Your thoughts on V for Vendetta? Wasn't on your list, but...
Yeah, I enjoyed it. It's probably in my top 20 or something like that, or 25. It's a good adaptation of the work, and I like the performances. I think if the Wachowskis themselves had maybe directed it, could have been a little better. But I did enjoy it, and I think it's just that some of these Alan Moore works, they're just a little concerned about it being a real literal translation. And this one, they kind of, changed things a little bit, I think, so that made it stand out a little bit better, I think, than Watchmen did.
Mm-hmm. Now, one that we definitely need to talk about is the Avengers, because a lot of people might have expected it near the top of the list. It didn't even make my list, but it was in the middle of yours at number 3. So what are your brief thoughts on the Avengers?
Well, to me, it did this Marvel thing where all the characters were in separate movies and then they came together, kind of the reverse of what we're getting in the Batman-Superman movie. But I thought that's what really made it work. Joss Whedon did an amazing job with balancing all the screen time with these characters, having them all have their own moment, having a great mixture of action and some humor, and the movie didn't feel like it plodded along to me at all, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a real movie that set the bar for superhero movies to come after that.
Mm-hmm. I thought about putting it on my list, but then I realized I would only be putting it on my list because of other people kind of really holding it up. For me, I enjoyed it all right, but it hasn't really stood up to repeat viewing for me. For me, when I watch it again, it just, the one-liners all really stick out to me a lot, and so I kind of can't put up with them very well for repeated viewings. And I do think, it's okay, it had some good sequences. I'm not a huge fan of Loki. A lot of people say Loki's like the best Marvel villain. If that's true, then that's pretty sad for Marvel, I think, because to me, he always just seems more like annoying, and he keeps, using his little tricks, which I know is part of his character, but to me it just doesn't quite work to a really strong level. So for me, I will say I enjoyed Avengers, but it has never really jumped to the top of my list of one that's really a favorite or one that I think really did some amazing things.
Gotcha. Well, and I think a lot of that has to do too that you're more of a DC guy, because really, Avengers is really well made for someone who likes Marvel comics.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, if people, I'm very open to listening to people, so you can jump in the comment boards if you want to try to change my mind about the Avengers. But going up, you've got Spider-Man 2, which is a movie that I agree is pretty good. I'm not the hugest Spider-Man fan, but I do recognize that Spider-Man 2 is a pretty good movie, and I did really enjoy it when I saw it. So what is it that stands out for you about Spidey 2?
Spider-Man 2 is the perfect Spider-Man story. It had everything. It had the Peter Parker self-doubt. He actually emotionally kind of loses his powers, because he doesn't believe in himself. He comes back. Doc Ock is an amazing Spider-Man villain. Willem Dafoe was good as a Green Goblin, but the costume wasn't good. Alfred Molina did a great job. MJ was good in it. It had a great mix of humor, action, and that train sequence still holds up as a great action set piece to, kind of set the bar, kind of like the Avengers did for its time, for superhero movies to come. But most importantly, out of all the things in that is the story in Spider-Man 2. From start to finish, it feels like a complete thing. You didn't need to see Spider-Man 1 to enjoy it. And, I don't think any of the other movies that Spider-Man has had have lived up to that film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually am going to agree with you on this one. For me, it didn't make my list only because we cut it to 5, but for me, it's probably knocking on the door at number 6 or number 7. I think it was well done. Mm-hmm. It's, if this was the only Spider-Man movie that we had, I think we would still be pretty happy. Mm-hmm. We have a lot more to choose from, but that one I think really was the pinnacle, like you said.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I've got Man of Steel at number 2 because Man of Steel is a movie that's very close to my heart. This is one where I've watched it so many times and it just keeps getting better and better. I really enjoy peeling back the layers of how they thought through the physics, they thought through the story, how they gave a really good motivation to the villain, to the point where some people have actually sided with the villain. And to me, that's where DC was trying to go, and where Warner Brothers was trying to go, was we're going to go into the gray areas of moral decisions and ethical decisions. We're going to make the relationship between Clark and his parents, or Clark and Lois, more complex than they have been in the past. And to me, I've just loved this movie. There's a great podcast called Man of Steel Answers, or Mosaic, but it's at manofsteelanswers.com. And this is a whole podcast that goes through the scenes of Man of Steel, goes through the themes, goes through the physics. And I've really enjoyed that podcast. I've read the novelization. I've just gotten into this movie so much. And what I've enjoyed is as I dig into it, there's always more there. And that's what I like. I really like to mentally toss things around and not just have a little popcorn fest. So for me, Man of Steel is one. It's not my number 1, but man, it's right close at number 2.
Cool. For me, the only reason it's not on my list is because as someone who grew up really loving the original Superman films, it's really hard to make a movie that can top that. Because if we weren't doing it just by era, the original Superman's definitely in my top 5. But Man of Steel, the performance by Cavill is super strong. The only thing besides the nostalgia of the original that keeps it off my list is that I found the last act of Man of Steel to be a little too over the top with the violence of the destruction of the whole city and everything. And that's the part where I watch it again where I feel Zack Snyder kind of took it a little too far. So I'm hoping in Batman vs. Superman we're going to get a little less of that and more story, and it looks like that's going to be the case.
We could talk about this a lot more, but I will cut myself off. The one thing I will say is that Man of Steel Answers has a YouTube video that shows the extent of the destruction, which is, it's kind of just one neighborhood of Metropolis, not the whole city. But
it's just
but
the way it
I
was
hear what you're
filmed,
saying
right?
about how he's got to go fight the thing in the ocean. Then Metropolis is having the gravity weapon, and then he has to fight through Metropolis, with Zod. So it is these things piling up on each other. So I understand what you're saying there.
Yeah.
All right, that brings us to number 1, where we actually were in agreement on The Dark Knight as the number 1 comic book movie live action from this current era of 1998 to 2015. So what can we say about The Dark Knight? It's an amazing movie.
Yeah, to me, it comes down to what I've always said about it, is that if you take off the costumes of Batman and the Joker in this movie, it still holds up as an excellent crime movie. It's not just a superhero movie. It's an excellent story about, someone trying to stop a guy that's pure evil. And not evil for some crazy reason, like his dad cut him or something. He just likes to watch things burn, and he likes chaos. And Batman is trying to go against that and make sense of it somehow. And that's why, in some ways, in that movie, he fails, and he has to make sacrifices that they haven't shown in other superhero movies. Everything's great about the movie. The music, the direction, it stands alone. The action, the writing, the performances, and it's just a classic, and it's kind of like the Godfather of superhero movies.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's why I've got it at the top of my list. And this one, to me, like Man of Steel, it holds up to repeat viewings for sure. Like this one I've seen several times. Just watched it again like a week or two ago.
Nice.
It's just better every time. I get more little connections, or I get more of the nuance between the Dark Knight, the White Knight, the Joker, and kind of what they're representing in terms of like some of the things you were saying about anarchy versus chaos versus order versus trying to make sense of things. There's just so much there. Then it kind of goes without saying, but then there's Heath Ledger's Joker, which just jumps off the screen. It's just such a memorable portrayal of a villain. Everybody that sees that movie, you're going to remember this Joker. He's got so many great scenes and so many iconic kind of visuals. So that's also great. In our other video where we were talking about the earlier era of 1978 to 1997, we talked about how the Lex Luthor from the original Superman movies was not probably the greatest or not the most compelling villain. He was a little hokey and cheesy. But here we've got the opposite. In The Dark Knight, we have a great villain. I mean, probably the top villain in any comic book movie so far.
I would agree.
Yeah, so much good about that movie, like you said. It's number 1, and I think it's going to stay there for a while. Hopefully we, it sets the bar where we can hopefully look forward to things in the future that can rise to that level. But such a good film. Some people will complain about it, that it wasn't superhero enough. Like you were giving it credit for being a good movie. And some people have said it's not Batman enough, but I think they even recognize if you just think about it on the merits of a movie, it's a great one.
Oh, how is it not Batman enough? He does all the Batman things in it. He jumps off the side of a goddamn building in China or whatever that was, and gets a guy out in the middle of the night. Like they didn't even try anything that cool in the comic. Like, come on.
Yeah, no, I'm not with those people, but some of them will say, like, that he needs Lucius Fox to do some things that actually Batman should be able to do in terms of the technology or the detective work and that kind of stuff.
Hey, James Bond needs Q too, right? I mean, like, for a good movie, there's got to be more than just the lone hero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, real quick, because we're almost out of time, but some honorable mentions are X2, another good one. Yes. Blade, we did mention at the beginning of the era. That's another good one. Yep. 300's pretty good. I liked Kingsman, The Secret Service.
Yeah, I forgot about that. That was actually really well done.
Yeah, I think it has a unique way that they did some of the action in the fights.
Totally.
Hellboy is another one that I like.
Yes.
Didn't put on my list, but I think that's a good one. Yep. So we could have gone on for more, but we're already out of time. So thanks for going through this with me, Jason.
Hey, anytime. I really enjoyed it.